And tonight, I want to present you with your inspired love.
There are moments late in a man's life when success begins to feel quieter than it once did, and memory grows louder. For William Holden, the world saw a legend, calm, confident, unforgettable. But behind that image lived a different truth. He loved more than once, deeply at times, recklessly at others. And yet, something never quite held. Not fully, not forever. Because the real story of his life was not about fame, but about the women who shaped him, and the one he could never keep. And in the end, when everything else faded, only one name remained. Before we step into the private life of this Hollywood legend, tell me, when you think of William Holden, which film do you remember most? Let me know in the comments. The wife who stayed, while his heart left. In 1941, long before the fame fully settled on his shoulders, William Holden married Brenda Marshall, a woman who brought with her not just charm, but a sense of grounding he didn't yet realize he would need. At the time, he was still becoming the man the world would later admire. With Brenda, life felt structured, predictable, safe. They built a family. 2 sons were born in the years that followed, and Holden adopted Brenda's daughter from a previous marriage. By the late 1940s, as his career began to rise, especially after films like Sunset Boulevard, his life started to divide quietly into 2 worlds. One was the home Brenda maintained, steady, patient, unwavering. The other was the world he stepped into. Bright lights, long nights, and a growing distance he rarely spoke about. By the early 1950s, something had already shifted. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just slowly, almost invisibly. He was present, but not always there. Loving, but not always connected. And Brenda knew. She saw the changes that others didn't, the late returns, the silence that stretched longer than conversations, the feeling that part of him was always somewhere else. Still, she stayed. Not out of weakness, but out of a kind of quiet loyalty that defined her. There is always a moment in a marriage when love changes shape. For them, that moment didn't arrive with a fight. It arrived with distance. By the 1960s, what remained between them was no longer the beginning they once had. It was something quieter, functional, enduring, but no longer whole. And yet, she never left. Because sometimes, the strongest love isn't the one that burns the brightest, but the one that stays, even when it is no longer returned the same way. The love he lost, and never replaced. By 1953, everything in William Holden's life appeared settled from the outside. A successful career, a stable home, a name that carried weight in Hollywood. And then, he met her. On the set of Sabrina, he was introduced to a young actress whose presence didn't demand attention. It quietly transformed it. Audrey Hepburn was different, not just in beauty, but in spirit. There was a softness to her, a sincerity that made everything around her feel more real. What began as admiration turned into something deeper, almost unexpectedly. By the time filming progressed through 1954, their connection had grown undeniable. Conversations lingered longer. Silences felt meaningful instead of empty. And somewhere in between scenes, Holden found himself facing a truth he hadn't planned for. He was falling in love, and Audrey was already there. For a brief moment, the world outside seemed to fade. The complications, the obligations, even time itself felt suspended in something fragile but real. Holden considered leaving everything behind. Not in theory, but in reality. But love, as it often does, collided with something immovable. There was a truth he had not told her, a decision from years earlier. He could not have children. When Audrey learned this in 1954, everything changed. Not because the love disappeared, but because her future suddenly did. She had always dreamed of becoming a mother, It wasn't a possibility she could quietly let go. So she made a choice. She walked away. There are moments in life when love isn't enough, not because it isn't strong, but because it asks for something one person cannot give. For Holden, this was that moment. He returned to his life, his marriage, his career. But something had shifted permanently. Because some loves don't end with anger or betrayal. They end with silence and the quiet knowledge that you will never find the same feeling again. The secret love he never claimed. By the early 1960s, the world around William Holden had grown louder. Fame, expectation, and a private life that no longer felt whole. The distance in his marriage had settled into something permanent, and somewhere in that quiet emptiness, another connection began. He met Capucine, a woman very different from the others who had passed through his life. She was thoughtful, reserved, almost introspective in a way that drew him in without effort. There was no rush, no spectacle, just understanding, and a kind of emotional depth he had been missing. What began in the early 1960s slowly turned into a relationship that would last, on and off, for years. But unlike the romance with Audrey, this one didn't live in the light. It existed quietly, almost carefully, because Holden was still married, and Capucine was never fully his. They shared time together away from the noise of Hollywood, conversations that felt honest, moments that didn't require performance. With her, he didn't have to be the man the world expected. He could simply be himself. But even that came with a cost. There is a particular kind of love that survives in fragments, never fully expressed, never fully secure. This was that kind. Capucine lived with a truth she could not change. She was part of his life, but not his life. Through the mid to late 1960s, their connection endured, fading and returning like something unfinished. No public declarations, no final commitment, just a quiet bond that never quite found its place in the world. And over time, that kind of love becomes something else. Not a beginning, not an ending, just a question that never resolves. Because sometimes, the deepest connections are not the ones we build openly, but the ones we keep hidden, even from ourselves. The woman who stayed when everything fell apart. By the early 1970s, time had begun to change everything for William Holden. The roles were different now. The pace had slowed, and the weight of years, of choices, of habits, of distance, had started to show. And then, in 1972, he met Stefanie Powers. She did not enter his life like a sudden storm. She arrived with calm, with clarity, with a kind of presence that didn't demand anything, but understood everything. Their connection grew not from intensity, but from shared meaning. Together, they spent long periods in Kenya, building something far removed from Hollywood. At places like the Mount Kenya Safari Club, life became quieter, more honest. They worked on wildlife conservation, creating a purpose that went beyond fame, beyond image. For the first time in years, Holden wasn't chasing something. He was living it. But life does not erase what came before. By the mid to late 1970s, his struggles, especially with alcohol, had deepened. It was no longer something hidden in the background. It was present, persistent, and impossible to ignore. Stefanie saw it. She lived through it. And yet, she stayed, not blindly, not without pain, but with a kind of strength that doesn't often make headlines. She understood him, not just the man the world admired, but the man who was slowly unraveling beneath it. There is a difference between loving someone at their best and standing beside them at their worst. She chose the second. By the time the 1980s approached, what they shared was no longer just love. It was companionship, real, grounded, imperfect, but present. And sometimes, in the final chapters of a life, that becomes the most honest form of love there is. Because it isn't built on possibility, but on truth. The woman he almost had, but never did. In the mid-1950s, As William Holden stood at the height of his fame, there were certain names that seemed to orbit the same rare air, faces that defined an era, presences that carried both mystery and admiration. One of those names was Grace Kelly. She was, in many ways, everything Hollywood projected as perfection: elegant, composed, almost untouchable. And naturally, the world assumed that someone like Holden would be drawn to someone like her. And perhaps he was. There were whispers, moments, a sense that their paths crossed not just professionally, but personally, however briefly. But unlike the loves that shaped him, this connection never fully formed into something real. It remained just out of reach. And yet, there may have been a moment, quiet, unnoticed, when Holden saw her not as the world did, but simply as a woman he could have known differently. A brief pause, a passing conversation, and a thought he never said out loud. In another life, this might have been simple, but it wasn't his life. What makes this chapter important isn't what happened, but what didn't. Because Grace Kelly represents something different in Holden's story. Not love, not loss, but the illusion of perfection. By 1956, when she left Hollywood to become Princess of Monaco, that possibility, real or imagined, quietly disappeared, and Holden remained where he was, with the life he had chosen and the loves that had already begun to shape him. Not every connection is meant to become something. Some people pass through our lives only to remind us of what looked right, but was never truly ours. The first temptation before fame took over. In the early 1940s, before the awards, before the global recognition, William Holden was still learning how Hollywood worked and what it could take from you in return. It was a world built on ambition, proximity, and unspoken rules. And somewhere in that environment, he crossed paths with one of its most formidable figures, Barbara Stanwyck. Stanwyck was already established, confident, respected. She carried herself with a certainty that younger actors noticed immediately. Holden, still finding his footing around 1941 to 1943, was part of a generation looking up at figures like her. Not just for inspiration, but for direction. There have long been quiet suggestions of something more than professional respect between them. Nothing loudly confirmed, nothing deeply documented, but enough to suggest that, at some point, their connection moved just slightly beyond the surface. If it did, it didn't last. Because this wasn't a story about love. It was a story about proximity and possibility. What matters here is not whether they shared something lasting, but what this moment represented in Holden's life. It was a glimpse into the world he was entering, a world where relationships were often shaped by timing, by influence, by the constant movement of careers rising and falling. Stanwyck represented strength, control, experience, everything Holden was still becoming. And perhaps, for a brief moment, that contrast created a kind of pull, something undefined, but real enough to be remembered. By the mid-1940s, his path had already begun to move in a different direction. New roles, new responsibilities, a marriage already in place, the foundation of his life taking shape. And whatever existed in that earlier moment quietly faded into the background. Because some connections don't leave behind heartbreak. They leave behind awareness, an understanding of the world you've just stepped into, and the kind of man you are about to become. The one he truly loved, but couldn't keep. By the time the early 1980s approached, William Holden had lived more than most men ever would. Fame had come, success had stayed, and love had appeared in different forms, at different times. But when life begins to quiet, something else becomes clearer. Not the loudest moments, but the truest ones. There is a difference between the love you live with and the love that never leaves you. For Holden, that distinction led back, not forward, back to 1953 to 1954. Back to a film set, back to a woman who didn't just enter his life. She changed it. Audrey Hepburn was not the longest relationship he had. She was not the one who stayed, but she was the one who made everything else feel different after she was gone. That is the kind of love that doesn't fade with time. It settles, quietly, permanently. He went on to live decades beyond that moment. He built more relationships, shared years with others, laughed, worked, survived, but nothing ever replaced what he felt then. Because some loves are not measured by duration, but by impact, and hers never left him. In the end, there was no grand declaration recorded, no dramatic confession placed neatly into history, but those who knew his life understood the pattern, understood the silence, understood the return. Because even without words, a man reveals the truth of his heart by what he never forgets. And for William Holden, it was never the easiest love, never the longest, but it was the one that stayed with him, long after everything else had changed. The one he truly loved was the one he could not keep. In the end, the world remembered William Holden for his strength, his calm presence, the roles that never faded. But behind that image was a quieter truth, of love found in pieces, and the one that never truly let him go. Not every great love becomes a lifelong story. Some are only meant to change us and remain. So tell me, do you believe the greatest love is the one that stays, or the one that never leaves your heart? If this story stayed with you, take a moment to like, share your thoughts below, and subscribe for more timeless stories from Hollywood's golden age.